A gray wolf, frail and trembling, stands at the edge of a frozen forest. Her ribs press against her fur, and two tiny pups cling to her side, their breaths shallow in the bitter cold. She has no strength left. The blizzard roars around them, ice clinging to their fur like chains. Her body stiffens. She collapses. The pups cry, nudging her lifeless frame. Just when all hope seems lost. A porch light flickers on in the distance. A man stands at his cabin door, watching the dying family of wolves. What he does next will shock you and redefine everything you know about survival, love, and second chances. Get ready for a story that will break your heart and heal it all over again. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a biting chill that turned the snow into a swirling white abyss. The mother wolf staggered, her legs weak beneath her, each step a battle against exhaustion. Her two pups, barely old enough to walk, stumbled beside her, their tiny bodies shivering violently. The mother knew she was failing them. Food had been scarce for days, and the storm had stolen what little warmth they had left. In the distance, a dim glow flickered. A cabin. Her instincts warred against her desperation. Wolves and humans did not mix, but the alternative was death. With the last of her strength, she pressed forward, her eyes locking onto the flickering light. Just a few more steps, but her legs buckled. She collapsed into the snow, the pups crying beside her. Her breathing slowed. The darkness crept in. From the cabin's porch, a man watched. His rifle rested against the wall, but his hands remained still. He had seen many things in these woods: predators, prey, the cycle of life and death. But this was different. A mother on the brink of death. Pups too young to survive alone. His breath misted in the cold as he made a choice that would change everything. Daniel Reynolds had lived in the Montana wilderness for 5 years, isolated from the world he once knew. The cabin was his escape from a past that haunted him, a past filled with loss and regret. But as he stared at the wolves, he felt something stir inside him, a flicker of the man he used to be, the man who still believed in second chances. Carefully, he stepped off the porch, the snow crunching beneath his boots. His fingers brushed the rifle instinctively, but he let it rest. These creatures weren't a threat. They were victims of a cruel winter. Kneeling beside the mother wolf, he could see the frost clinging to her lashes, the slow rise and fall of her breath barely perceptible. The pups whined, their small bodies pressing against her, desperate for warmth. Daniel hesitated. Wolves were wild animals, unpredictable. If she survived, would she turn on him? But as he looked into her barely opened eyes, there was no fight left in them, only surrender. He reached out, wrapping the fragile mother in his thick coat before lifting her into his arms. The pups, unwilling to be separated, followed, stumbling after him as he carried their mother into the cabin. The warmth inside hit like a wave. The fire crackled, its golden glow illuminating the wooden walls. Daniel laid the mother wolf by the hearth, covering her with blankets. She barely stirred. Her body was ice cold. The pups huddled close to her, their tiny whimpers filling the cabin. Daniel worked quickly. He heated some broth, knowing she was too weak to eat solid food. Would she even have the strength to drink? He tilted a spoonful against her lips, watching anxiously. A long moment passed. Then, a weak flicker of movement. Her tongue barely licked the liquid. A spark of hope ignited in Daniel's chest. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Daniel was not a man who made impulsive decisions. Years of solitude had made him cautious, deliberate. But something about this wolf and her pups called to him in a way he couldn't ignore. He moved swiftly through the cabin, gathering supplies. A thick pile of blankets, a bowl of warm water. His hands were steady, his mind focused. This was survival, and he knew how to fight for it. The mother wolf's breathing was erratic, shallow. Her body remained still, but her ears twitched as he worked around her. The pups, sensing the warmth of the fire, curled up against her side. Daniel placed a gentle hand on her ribs, feeling the faint heartbeat beneath his fingertips. It was weak, but it was there. He didn't sleep that night. Every few hours, he coaxed her with more broth, ensuring she took in as much warmth as possible. The pups, though tiny, were resilient. They suckled weakly, their small bodies pressing against their mother's fur. Daniel watched over them, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. By morning, the storm had lessened, but the world outside remained an unforgiving white desert. Daniel knew that if she had any chance of survival, she needed more than warmth. She needed food, medicine, something he didn't have. He would have to make a trip to town, a journey that could take hours through the snow-covered terrain. But could he leave them alone? The mother wolf was fragile, teetering on the edge of life and death. The pups were too young to fend for themselves. A single mistake could mean the end for all of them. Daniel stood at the door, his breath misting in the cold morning air. He had a decision to make, a choice that would define not only their survival, but his own. Daniel knew he had no choice. If he stayed, the mother wolf and her pups might not survive the night, but leaving them unattended in such a vulnerable state was equally dangerous. The storm had calmed, but the trek to town was still treacherous, the deep snow slowing his pace. He took one last look at the mother wolf, her breath slow but steady. The pups were curled against her, their tiny chests rising and falling rhythmically. He bundled himself in his thickest coat, grabbed his hunting rifle, just in case, and packed a small bag with essentials. Before stepping out, he placed extra logs in the fireplace, ensuring the cabin stayed warm. The wind was sharp as he trudged forward, each step sinking deep into the snow. He knew the route by heart, having made this trip countless times. But today, every moment felt heavier. He wasn't just walking for himself, he was walking for them. Hours passed. The town, usually bustling, was eerily quiet under the heavy snowfall. Daniel made his way to the local veterinary supply, explaining his situation in brief but urgent words. The old veterinarian, Dr. Harris, eyed him skeptically before nodding. "You're taking in a wild animal, Reynolds?" Daniel exhaled. "I didn't have a choice." Dr. Harris handed him a small pack of medicine and instructions on how to administer it. "You'll need to be careful. If she recovers, she may not see you as a friend." Daniel nodded, stuffing the supplies into his bag and setting off toward home before the storm worsened again. As he trekked back, the sun had already started to set, casting long shadows over the frozen landscape. The temperature plummeted further, and Daniel pushed forward, his body growing numb with the cold. The weight of the supplies felt heavier with each step. When he finally reached the cabin, his breath was ragged, and his hands barely responded as he fumbled with the door. Inside, warmth engulfed him, but his relief was short-lived. The mother wolf lay motionless. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought he was too late. With hurried hands, he knelt beside her, pressing his fingers against her chest. A faint heartbeat. Weak, but there. He worked quickly, administering the medicine as carefully as he could. The pups whimpered at his side, watching anxiously. The night stretched on in agonizing silence as he kept vigil over the fragile family, unsure if dawn would bring hope or heartbreak. The moment Daniel stepped back into the cabin, the mother wolf stirred. Her ears twitched at the sound of his boots crunching against the wooden floor. The pups, sensing their caretaker's return, scampered toward him, their tails wagging feebly. He set down the supplies and got to work. The medicine had to be given carefully, too much, and it could do more harm than good. He mixed it into warm broth, kneeling beside the wolf as he offered it to her. Her golden eyes met his for a long, tense moment. Then, slowly, she lapped at the bowl, her movements sluggish but willing. Relief flooded Daniel. She was fighting, and so was he. But trust wasn't built overnight. The days that followed were filled with careful steps, hushed movements, and a growing understanding between man and beast. The mother wolf no longer flinched at his presence, though she remained wary. The pups, on the other hand, had fully accepted him, following him around the cabin and curling up at his feet by the fire. Daniel spent hours observing the mother wolf, trying to understand her silent language. She never acted aggressively, but her eyes always held a quiet watchfulness. The pups, now slightly stronger, were growing more adventurous, nosing around the room and playing in front of the fire. One particularly cold evening, Daniel sat at the table, sharpening his knife. The mother wolf, instead of retreating to her usual corner, lay just a few feet away, watching his every movement. It was a shift, subtle, but significant. He spoke softly to her, telling her stories of his past, of why he had come to live in the wilderness, of the losses that had driven him to solitude. He didn't know if she understood, but somehow it felt like she did. Days turned into weeks, and slowly trust deepened. The mother wolf had begun moving more freely around the cabin, though she still kept a careful distance. One morning, Daniel awoke to find her standing by the door, staring at the snow-covered landscape outside. Her body had grown stronger, and the wild instinct in her eyes was undeniable. Daniel knew the moment would come when she would have to choose: stay with him or return to the wild. He had never intended to tame her, only to help her heal. But the thought of her leaving left an unexpected ache in his chest. Then, one night, something unexpected happened. A howl echoed in the distance, a deep, resonant call carried by the wind. The mother wolf's ears perked, her body tensing. Daniel watched as she lifted her head, staring at the door, her entire frame alert. A pack was out there. Perhaps her own, perhaps strangers. Either way, it was the world she belonged to. Daniel swallowed hard, realizing the inevitable. He had saved her, but she was never his to keep. The question was, when the time came, would she leave? The distant howl echoed again, stretching across the silent, frozen landscape like a song carried by the wind. It was a call, one that the mother wolf could not ignore. Daniel saw it in her eyes, the way her ears twitched and her muscles tensed. It was instinct, primal and unshakable. For days, she had remained close to the fire, resting, regaining her strength, and caring for her pups. She had allowed Daniel to help, had tolerated his presence, and even, in small ways, trusted him. But now, standing before the door, she was faced with a choice: the safety of the cabin or the call of the wild. Daniel exhaled heavily. He knew this day would come, but he hadn't expected it to be so soon. He had prepared himself for the reality that she was never truly his. She belonged to something greater. But as he looked at her, standing strong and alert, something inside him resisted the idea of letting her go. The pups, still too young to understand, played near the fire, unaware of the silent conversation happening between Daniel and their mother. He knew that if she left now, the pups would be left behind. Would she abandon them? Would she take them with her into the unknown, risking their survival against the harsh wilderness? He crouched down, looking into her golden eyes. "You hear them, don't you?" he whispered. She didn't flinch. Her gaze remained locked on his, but the weight of the call was evident. A moment passed, then another. Finally, she turned her head toward the door, her body shifting as if preparing to leave. But then she hesitated. Daniel wasn't sure what she was thinking. Was she afraid? Was she torn between two worlds? Or did she understand that leaving meant leaving behind the man who had saved her life? The tension in the cabin was thick. The pups, sensing something was different, whimpered and scurried to their mother's side. She lowered her head and licked them softly, a silent reassurance. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. "If you need to go, I won't stop you," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "But they're too young." The mother wolf looked at her pups, then at Daniel, and back at the door. The howls outside grew fainter, but they still lingered, calling her home. She took a step toward the entrance, then another, her tail swaying gently. Daniel watched in silence, his heart heavy. He had spent weeks caring for her, watching over her, and ensuring she survived. But she wasn't his to keep. The wild was her home. Then, something unexpected happened. Instead of pushing against the door or growling for him to open it, the mother wolf turned back. She walked toward Daniel, cautiously but deliberately, and nudged his hand with her muzzle. It was the first real sign of affection she had ever given him. His fingers brushed against her thick fur, and for a fleeting moment, the world seemed to pause. She wasn't just thanking him, she was acknowledging him as part of her story. Then, just as quickly, she stepped back, her resolve returning. Daniel stood and opened the door. The cold wind rushed in, carrying with it the scent of the wild. The mother wolf looked at him once more, then at her pups. She didn't move immediately. Instead, she waited. It was as if she needed him to understand something, perhaps that this wasn't goodbye, not entirely. And then, With one last, lingering glance, she stepped out into the snow. The pups cried out, their tiny voices piercing the cold air. But she didn't look back. She disappeared into the night, her silhouette vanishing against the moonlit trees. Daniel closed the door slowly, leaning against it as he let out a heavy breath. He had done what he could. He had given her a second chance. Now, it was up to her to find her place in the world. He turned to the pups, who were now huddled together, confused and uncertain. He sighed. "Looks like it's just us now." They whimpered, pressing against his leg. He knelt down, scooping them up in his arms. They were small, fragile, but resilient, just like their mother. As he sat by the fire, holding them close, Daniel knew one thing for certain. His journey with them was far from over. And somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness, a mother wolf roamed free, knowing that the man who saved her had also saved her young. But would she ever return? The fire crackled softly in the cabin, casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. Daniel sat in his worn-out armchair, the two wolf pups curled up on his lap. Their tiny bodies radiated warmth, but the absence of their mother still lingered like a ghost in the room. The silence was different now, no longer filled with the cautious, watchful presence of the mother wolf, but with something heavier: uncertainty. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair, exhaling slowly. Caring for the mother had been a challenge, but raising these pups on his own? That was something else entirely. He had no experience raising wild animals, no knowledge of what they needed beyond the basic essentials of food and warmth. Could they even survive without her guidance? Would they ever be able to return to the wild, or had they become too accustomed to human care? He wasn't sure if he had done the right thing by taking them in. Part of him had hoped their mother would return, that maybe, just maybe, she would realize she couldn't leave them behind. But deep down, he knew she had made her choice, and now he had to make his. The next morning, Daniel ventured outside, bundled against the biting wind. The snow had settled, thick and untouched, covering the landscape like a vast frozen ocean. He looked toward the tree line, his breath misting in the cold air. No sign of her. He sighed and turned back toward the cabin. If he was going to raise them, he needed to be prepared. That meant hunting more food, ensuring they stayed warm, and perhaps, though the thought made his stomach churn, figuring out if he would ever be able to release them back into the wild. But how? Would they even know how to fend for themselves? As the days passed, Daniel found himself forming an unspoken bond with the pups. They followed him around the cabin, nipping at his boots as he worked, their playful yips filling the once empty silence. At night, they nestled beside him near the fire, their tiny bodies twitching in dreams. Each day, he watched them grow stronger, their legs steadier, their eyes brighter. They were surviving. But for how long? One evening, as he chopped firewood outside, he heard a distant howl. His heart clenched. It was her. Somewhere, out in the vast wilderness, the mother wolf still roamed. Was she looking for them? Did she regret leaving? Or was she simply calling to the night, her instincts guiding her away from the life she had known? The pups lifted their heads, ears twitching at the sound. They whimpered, shifting uneasily. Daniel crouched beside them, his fingers brushing through their thickening fur. He had a decision to make. Keep them here, safe but disconnected from their true nature, or find a way to reunite them with the life they were meant to live. That night, sleep did not come easily. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside. The weight of responsibility bore down on him, pressing like a stone on his chest. If he kept them, they would never learn to be wild. But if he let them go too soon, they might not survive. He had saved them once. Could he do it again? Morning came with a decision. He would teach them, train them, prepare them for the world beyond the safety of the cabin. It would take time, patience, and effort, but if there was a chance they could one day rejoin their mother, he had to try. With renewed determination, he set out into the snow, the pups trailing at his heels. Their journey was far from over. The days passed in a blur of effort and determination. Daniel spent every waking moment teaching the pups what they needed to know to survive in the wild. He took them on short excursions beyond the cabin, letting them experience the snow-covered terrain, the whispering trees, and the scent of the wild that lay just beyond their sheltered world. They were clumsy at first, unsure of themselves, but with each passing day, their instincts sharpened. He watched as they learned to track small prey, their paws pressing softly against the snow as they followed faint trails. He taught them to recognize danger, the sound of a snapping branch, the distant cry of a larger predator. They were still young, still vulnerable, but the fire of survival was growing inside them. Yet, even as they adapted, Daniel felt the weight of an unspoken truth pressing down on him. They were not meant to stay. No matter how much he cared for them, no matter how deeply he had grown attached, they did not belong to this world of walls and warmth. They belonged out there, with her. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, turning the sky into a swirl of orange and violet, the familiar howl returned. It was stronger this time, closer. The mother wolf was searching for them. Daniel stood at the edge of the trees, the pups at his feet. They heard it too. Their ears perked, their bodies tensed. For the first time, he saw hesitation in their young eyes. They had grown comfortable with him, trusted him. But this was their world calling to them, the world they had been born into. He knelt down, running a hand through their thick fur. "It's time," he murmured. The words felt heavy in his throat. "You have to go." The pups whined, nudging against him, uncertain. He felt the sting of loss before it had even happened, but he knew this was right. Another howl. This time, one of the pups lifted its head and responded with a small, wobbly call of its own. The other followed. It was instinct, a language they were rediscovering. Daniel felt his heart tighten as they took hesitant steps forward. And then, from the shadows of the trees, she emerged. The mother wolf was thinner than when she had left, her fur dusted with frost, but her eyes burned with something fierce. She stood tall, proud, yet cautious as she watched her young. The pups hesitated, torn between two worlds. Then, with a final glance at Daniel, they moved toward her. She sniffed them, nudging them gently, confirming what she had longed to find. Then she turned her gaze to Daniel. For a long moment, they stared at each other. An unspoken understanding passed between them. She knew. She understood what he had done for them. Without a sound, she turned and began to walk into the forest. The pups looked back one last time. Daniel forced himself to smile. "Go on," he whispered. "Be free." And then they were gone. Daniel stood there for a long time, listening to the fading sounds of their movement. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees, filling the empty space they had left behind. He had done what was right, but the silence in the cabin that night was unlike any he had ever known. Sitting by the fire, staring at the empty spot where the pups once curled up, he let out a slow breath. He had saved them, raised them, and now he had let them go. Somewhere out there, a family was whole again. And deep down, Daniel knew he would never forget them. As Daniel sat by the fire that night, he felt a deep sense of loss, but also a quiet pride. He had done what was right. The mother wolf and her pups had returned to the wild, where they truly belonged. The silence in the cabin felt heavy, but it was a silence of closure, of knowing he had made a difference in their lives. His journey with them had taught him something profound, that love is not about possession, but about giving others the chance to be free, even if it means letting them go. And now, it's your turn to be part of this journey. If this story touched your heart, remember, courage and compassion can overcome any challenge. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who loves heartfelt stories like this one. Your support helps us bring more inspiring tales of resilience, connection, and hope to life.